Hey guys, Kyle Kulinski is letting us post some of the clips from his channel that we think you guys will really love in the Breaking Points community on our channel.
Yep, let's get to it.
So Noam Chomsky has been doing a bunch of interviews recently. He spoke to Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs, and he also spoke to Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept. He's a busy man for being 178 years old, if I don't say so myself. So first, what I want to do, I'm going to get to a video in a second. It's a piece of the interview he did with Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept. But before I do that, let me show you the thing he said to Nathan J. Robinson, which is leading to quite a bit of backlash online. And I would say it's, bipartisan backlash to some extent. But anyway, so somebody tweeted, "Sage old Noam Chomsky patiently explaining to Ukrainians, few of whom I suspect he's actually spoken to about this, that they really have no choice but to surrender and concede to Russia virtually everything it demands, quote, because that's just the way the world works. Disgraceful." So this is what somebody said, a guy named Vincent Artman. So let me read the passage that he puts in the tweet here, the passage that people are angry at him over. So Chomsky said the following, "So I'm not criticizing Zelensky. He's an honorable person and has shown great courage. You can sympathize with his positions, but you can also pay attention to the reality of the world, and that's what it implies. I'll go back to what I said before. There are basically two options. One option is to pursue the policy we are now following, to quote Ambassador Freeman again, to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And yes, we can pursue that policy with the possibility of nuclear war. Or we can face the reality that the only alternative is a diplomatic settlement, which will be ugly. It will give Putin and his narrow circle an escape hatch. It will say, here's how you can get out without destroying Ukraine and going back to destroy the world. We know the basic framework is neutralization of Ukraine, some kind of accommodation for the Donbas region with a high level of autonomy, maybe within some federal structure in Ukraine, and recognizing that, like it or not, Crimea is not on the table. You may not like it. You may not like the fact that there's a hurricane coming tomorrow, but you can't stop it by saying, I don't like hurricanes, or I don't recognize hurricanes. That doesn't do any good. And the fact of the matter is, every rational analyst knows that Crimea is, for now, off the table. That's the alternative to the destruction of Ukraine and nuclear war. You can make heroic statements if you'd like about not liking hurricanes or not liking the solution, but that's not doing anyone any good. Okay, so I should note here that when he says Crimea is off the table, he's clearly not saying Crimea is off the table as in that will continue to be part of Ukraine. He's saying Crimea is off the table as in Russia's had control of it since 2014, and so it's going to be under Russian control either officially or in some unofficial way, but it will not leave Russian control. So, a lot of criticism over this. I would say the aspect of the criticism that I understand is, if Noam Chomsky is talking about the war in Iraq, I don't think Noam Chomsky would say something along the lines of, Iraq needs to live in the real world and understand that you're going to have to make some giant concessions to the marauding imperialist invader. That wouldn't be the bulk of his commentary. Now, that's because he's from the U.S., and so he feels responsible for the actions of the U.S., and so he would put the burden more on us. But I do get the criticism in the sense that, large superpowers do messed up things. And you can, across the board denounce it when the U.S. does it, but also you can recognize when another large, powerful government is doing a messed up thing and put the burden and the onus on that country. So I don't know if I'd call it a blind spot, but I'd say there is a problem with his thinking here where, again, if it was the U.S. doing it, he would reserve the bulk of his commentary to bashing the aggression of the U.S., but when Russia is illegally invading another country and occupying it, he doesn't, there's not much of that. To an extent, it's like, well, of course they shouldn't do it, but it's also, hey, this is sort of the reality of the world, so, you're going to have to accept certain things here. And so I do understand the criticism to some extent. However, I also think people are sort of misstating Chomsky's position because you can take this little portion out of the interview and say, this encapsulates everything about Noam Chomsky's position. But that's definitely not true because I watched that entire interview, or I watched a lot of the interview he did with Jeremy Scahill over at The Intercept. And now, let me show you that video so you get a more fully fleshed out take on what his position really is.
We can take time to talk about the broader historical context, and you've been discussing this a lot in other interviews. But I want to just start by asking you, is there any aspect of the US, NATO, and European Union response to this invasion that you believe is just? The weapons transfers to Ukraine, the sweeping economic sanctions and attempts to entirely isolate not only Russia and Putin, but ordinary Russians. Is there any aspect of the government response to this by the US, NATO, or the European Union that you agree with?
I think that support for Ukraine's effort to defend itself is legitimate. If it is, of course, it has to be carefully scaled so that it actually improves their situation and doesn't escalate the conflict to lead to destruction of Ukraine and possibly beyond. Sanctions against the aggressor are appropriate, just as sanctions against Washington would have been appropriate when it invaded Iraq or Afghanistan or many other cases. Of course, that's unthinkable given U.S. power. And in fact, the first few times it has been done, the one time it has been done, the U.S. simply shrugged its soldiers and escalated the conflict. Well, that was Nicaragua, when the U.S. was brought to the World Court, condemned for unlawful use of force, ordered to pay reparations, responded by escalating the conflict. But so it's unthinkable in the case of the U.S., but it would be appropriate. However, I still think it's not quite the right question. The right question is, what is the best thing to do to save Ukraine from a grim fate, from further destruction? And that's to move towards a negotiated settlement. There are some simple facts that aren't really controversial. There are two ways for a war to end. One way is for one side or the other to be basically destroyed. And the Russians are not going to be destroyed. So that means one way is for Ukraine to be destroyed. The other way is some negotiated settlement. If there's a third way, no one's ever figured it out. So what we should be doing is devoting all the things you mentioned, if properly shaped, but primarily moving towards a possible negotiated settlement that will save Ukrainians from further disaster.
So that's his full position. And when I look at him describe his full position, I think that's very reasonable. I don't see much to pick apart there. So let's go through it. He says, support for Ukraine's effort to defend itself is legitimate. And then he adds the caveat, if it's carefully scaled and doesn't escalate. So I think what he means by that is, yeah, they have a right to defend themselves and they can and should be armed, but don't, set up a no-fly zone for them and drag the U.S. into it. Don't give them false hope. And also perhaps don't arm the Azov battalion, the neo-Nazis who are officially part of the Ukrainian National Guard. So I think he's just saying you can give them weapons to defend themselves, but don't go too far and perhaps give certain kinds of weapons that could escalate the conflict and draw in the West and make it devolve out of control where, nuclear war is on the table. So I totally agree with him on that point. And in fact, I think he's way more correct than the mainstream opinion, certainly in mainstream media, where they seem to believe give them any and all weapons and also set up a no-fly zone where NATO and or the US is shooting Russian planes out of the sky, which is direct military conflict between two nuclear armed powers, which would be an absolute catastrophe and disaster. So I agree with him on that. And I got to be honest, I'm a little surprised that he's saying that he supports any weaponry going to Ukraine. But he does. He just said, I support Ukraine's effort to defend itself, and it's legitimate. You just need to make sure you carefully scale the weaponry and don't escalate it. Then he even says sanctions against the aggressor, by that he means Russia, are appropriate. He goes on to say, as it was, if people wanted to sanction the U.S. after what we did in Iraq, that would have been appropriate. Now, I will add the little asterisk here, and this is just my position, but I'm sure he would agree if somebody were to bring this up to him. I don't support any of the sanctions that hurt the Russian population. I would try to target the sanctions as much as possible to Putin, his inner circle, the military, the oligarchs. And really, as a matter of principle, I think that that's the best response. Even if it doesn't lead to quote-unquote positive outcomes, you can't just let one country invade another sovereign country and sit there and watch it. Now, again, I'm consistent on that because I say the same thing when the U.S. does it. Nobody should just sit there and watch the U.S. commit war crimes and invade sovereign countries. It's wrong when we do it, so it's wrong when Russia does it. So there should be standards and rules and laws that are upheld in the process of that. So Chomsky doesn't say here that he supports or doesn't support the sanctions against the people of Russia, but I assume he'd agree that going after the people of Russia is way too far because that's just collective punishment and they're innocent bystanders. They didn't do anything wrong, and so you shouldn't crack down on them. But look, I mean, when you look at when you look at the first comment that I shared with you from the interview with Current Affairs, you would have no idea that this is what Chomsky believes as well. To some extent, arming Ukraine to defend themselves, and to some extent, sanctioning Russia are totally legitimate. So now you see maybe the backlash was way overblown, and people were strawmanning him to some extent in the sense that it's misleading to just show that comment of his without giving the rest of his position. Then he goes on to say there's going to have to be a negotiation and some diplomatic settlement. Effectively, because the other options are what? Like, what are the other options? Endless escalation to eventual World War III? That's a potential, another option. Or an endless 10-year war where, Russia is just bogged down in Ukraine and you get the death toll rising nonstop. And so when you look at all the real options that are on the table, yeah, it makes sense. We should want to have a negotiation, want to do a diplomatic settlement. And yes, the nature of diplomatic settlements, especially in situations like this, nobody's going to be happy. Nobody's going to be happy. Ukraine, of course, isn't going to be happy. Russia is not going to be happy. But we need to find a way out. We need to find a way out because we're really playing with fire here. And so the other point, though, is one that is the most complicated to me because what would that settlement look like? That's the question. Well, I've reported to you guys based on a number of things I've read and a number of things that have been reported that Zelensky had put on the table basically all of Russia's main asks. So, Russia's main asks, neutrality for Ukraine, as in, don't be part of NATO and perhaps don't form other alliances with the West. That's one of the things on the table. Zelensky had a number of times conceded on that front and said, look, it is what it is. Even if I want to be part of NATO, we're not going to be part of NATO because there's a roadblock within NATO. So yes, we're going to be neutral. So total concession on that. The other thing is the Donbass region. Some settlement for the Donbass region, either where you have the two independent republics actually become independent republics or you have them become part of Russia or a certain percentage of them becomes part of Russia. Now, he has previously put that on the table as well. And then the other thing, of course, is Crimea. And there were indications in the press that Zelensky had also put that on the table. And so on the main prongs, the one that they cannot give in on under any circumstances, total disarming. That's insane. No, nobody would give into that, nor should they. Okay, but all the other things are on the table. So some sort of solution would look like that. But now I've since seen headlines talking about how certain things here are now off the table. So if Zelensky had put, particularly I think the Donbass region and Crimea, they were put on the table, and now I've read some headlines within the past 2 or 3 days that they're off the table. So I don't really know now, what truly is on the table and what isn't on the table. But any sort of deal is going to include most of those things or all of those things. I will say there's one response to Chomsky here which could be correct, but we just have no way of knowing, which is an argument you could make if you disagree with Chomsky is look, you want to have some diplomatic settlement, right? And you want to enforce that and get relative stability and peace. Any reasonable person would understand that. But what if you do that and then Russia doesn't stop? What if you do that and you can't appease Putin because he's got his mindset on further territorial expansion? And so then you have a situation where it would be fair to call everybody who is pushing most aggressively for peace Neville Chamberlain. And it's like, you guys are naive. Look at what you did. You made a deal with the devil, and then now the devil is doing what the devil does. And so that's the only critique I could see of Chomsky that is actually sound, in the sense that you are accepting all of the contours and nuances of his argument, and you accurately represent his position, and then you respond to it. Now, this is not the critique I see coming against Chomsky. People are not making that critique, but that is a theoretical critique you could make if you disagree with him. But my position on it is, you got to take the chance. Like, you got to give peace a chance. You have to try to get some sort of settlement here. And again, it's not going to make anybody happy, but it's doable, and it's the least bad of all bad options. But I will say, it's not my decision to make, right? Now, the U.S., our negative role in this is that we don't appear to be offering an off-ramp. We don't appear to be wanting a diplomatic settlement. But you could argue, Putin doesn't want it either, right? Or else he would have already made it if some of those things were actually on the table. But my take is, you have to try. You have to try to give peace a chance, because the other options are just significantly worse. And look, if we get to the point where we make a deal, we think the deal's enforced, and then within a year, Putin tries to do more territorial expansion, well, then the argument that he was unappeasable is perhaps totally legitimate, and we'll have to reevaluate at the time. But where we are right now, I don't think we can come to that conclusion definitively, and so we really have no other options. So ultimately, what I would say is, I largely agree with Chomsky here. I largely agree with Chomsky. It is up to the Ukrainians, and here's what I think will happen, hopefully. At some point, they will make some sort of a deal, and that could come relatively soon, which would be positive because fewer people would die, or maybe the fighting drags on for years. And then after years, everybody's appetite for war subsides, and they're in like a permanent stalemate to some extent, and then you get that peace deal. So, but again, what I favor is not really as relevant as what the people on the ground in Ukraine favor. And so you just sort of have to let the peace process run its course and see where it leads. I could understand why people would say, hey, Chomsky, who are you to make this choice? If they want to fight to the last Ukrainian, that's their prerogative. But I think he's coming at this from the perspective he wants to see less death and less destruction. And I understand that. So, yes, that first comment, there are some criticisms that I think are fair. But when he fleshes out his entire position, I really don't see much wrong with his position at all. Because he says he supports Ukraine's effort to defend itself, and arming them to some extent is legitimate, but it has to be, proportionate or proportional, whatever the word is. Sanctions against the aggressor, Russia, are appropriate, as it was against the U.S. when we did Iraq. Although I would say, don't go too far where you hurt civilians. And again, he wants a negotiated settlement because what are our other options? Drag the war out for years and years and years, or escalate towards World War III? Those are unthinkable. So, again, the weird part of it is Zelensky. Previously, there was reporting he did put the Donbass region on the table for some sort of a deal. He did put Crimea on the table for some sort of a deal, and he's already conceded on neutralization. The only thing he's not backing off of is you must disarm, which he's right to not back off of that. That was the previous reporting. Now the new reporting is those things are actually off the table, or certain of those are off the table. So I don't know where we're at in the peace process. And I know that the U.S. is really not interested too much in peace because we're not providing an off-ramp for Putin. And arguably, Putin's not at all interested in peace right now either, because if he wants it, he could just withdraw. But he's not doing that because he still has, some long-term goals here. There is reporting he's backed off of Kyiv in particular. I guess they got bogged down there. They couldn't capture it like they wanted to capture it. So now they're settling for less, namely probably something involving Donbass and Crimea. But anyway, there you have it. Those are Chomsky's comments. There was a big backlash and a dog pile, but when you listen to his full fleshed out position, while I have little disagreements with it here and there, I think it's largely reasonable.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.